community. I have decided to focus this by talking about the three of the larger characters that Charles Marsh referenced in the book, Martin Luther King Jr., Clarence Jordan, and John Perkins, who I actually got to meet him about a year and a half ago at a Christian Community Development Association conference, so that was a lot of fun. So as I read Marsh and looked through the stories of these three characters, what I noticed was the way theology, justice, and community worked in both of these stories and how that works. So for Martin Luther King, in particular, in this idea of nonviolent resistance in the Montgomery bus boycott, it starts with an issue of justice, of injustice, with Rosa Parks being arrested for not moving in the bus. And out of that injustice, a community came together, and a community formed into the MIA and formed into something that needed to respond to justice. And that response flowed out of that community. And what Martin Luther King Jr. was able then to do was to use his theological background, his Christian faith, and the Christian faith of many of those within that community to formulate a theological and a Christian response to the injustice, and that being that nonviolent resistance, that loving one's enemy and loving them to do good. And that's very much what I think the beloved community, as far as Charles Marsh is concerned, is coming out of, is that the community, justice, and theology flow into each other in those kinds of ways. And so in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., and particularly the Montgomery boycott, the injustice led to a community standing up and coming together in ways that it had not before. And that community, led by Martin Luther King Jr., to take on a Christian theological stance of nonviolent response and instead of loving of one's enemy, led to this peaceful communal response, and this community standing up and resisting, coming together, transporting each other, resisting the temptation to jump on and use a bus for convenience sake, but instead coming together to boycott and do so for a very extensive period of time. And ultimately, justice was then realized through this, through the community, through the theology, coming together and working together. Injustice was ended, particularly regarding the buses and where the blacks had to sit, and justice was realized. And so within a beloved community, then they move together. Same sort of happens with Clarence Jordan. In this context, community becomes a very important context and construct for Clarence Jordan, and wanting to have this communal embrace and to exemplify the scriptural understanding of what it means to live in community with one another. And that's what he creates. And he creates this community, but as he's creating this community, as this community is being formed, they encounter injustice. And the first place that I thought was interesting is that injustice was encountered in creation. The particular reason they purchased that land in that particular place was not as an act of social justice and nonviolent resistance to some kind of Jim Crow law or segregation, but because the very land that they had found that was available was gouged, was cut up, was barren, was desolate. And I found that to be quite particularly interesting to choose how to live out community and to face justice and injustices, in this case in the area of creation injustice. And that drove this community, this beloved community then that was trying to be exemplified, into action. And so that land was purchased, and they began to build community there. And the theology that flew out of that about creation, about others, led to those decisions that all were welcome, even those who the community around them wanted them to avoid having there. And that led to, in addition to additional injustices in different ways for Jordan and that community to show justice and love to those who were fighting injustice. I like that part where they became almost a retreat center, a meeting place, a Sabbath rest, or refreshing. The issue of justice played very much into the way they lived their lives and they encountered their lives. Now that led for them to face severe persecution and injustice, but their community and their theology held them together to make it through those extremely difficult times, and they still exist today. So it's an interesting move. But again, that beloved community forms from that community. It was impacted by justices and injustices that formulated their theologies that then reciprocated back into how they faced justice and injustice, and how that community was continually formed and becoming a transformed community. And this is really where I think John Perkins, his story so poignantly paints, is here is a person who grew up in that Jim Crow, under that Jim Crow laws, and in the South, whose family was destroyed because of it, and he got out, but theology called him back. God moved in his heart, and as he encountered God in the church and in his scripture reading, God moved him to come back and to present Christian theology and lived out ways to the community that he was from. And so he did that. But the community shifted those things. The community that he encountered, the people he encountered, the needs he encountered, the personalities, the uniquenesses, the raw people that he lived side by side and encountered, began to transform that theology, began to transform that action, and that budded up then very quickly to what does that mean when we face these injustices, and how does justice get lived out from this theology within this community? How do we face this justice and injustice? And so obviously that moved him and his community to begin to actually act in non-violent, resistant ways towards injustices that they encountered. But that was still founded on a very solid Christian theology that looked for spiritual and holistic transformation of individual and communities' lives, so that it wasn't just an issue of justice. It wasn't a politicalization, which by the time Perkins was doing this work in Mississippi, some of the civil rights movement has shifted from that connection with community and theology to just an issue of justice, and it clearly dissolved because of that, according to Charles Marsh. And so the injustice transformed John Perkins in profound ways, as the horrific story that he shares, that Charles Marsh references in this book, and he shares in his other autobiography that I've had a chance to read, of how that sheriff treated him. And what I don't recall being referenced in this, later on, John Perkins and the sheriff actually worked together to face some of these injustices within the community. And so God transforms hate into love, into community. And again, that transforms John Perkins' theology, the transformation of theology from a very fundamentalist theology, as Charles Marsh referenced, to one that was more social justice and beloved community oriented. Again, I think then, based on all of these, for Charles Marsh and for what I would understand, is that theology, justice, and community all flow into each other in order to create this beloved community where our love for one another within the community shapes our response to the needs and the realities of our community and moves us into the world around us, keeping centered on a theology of Christ and Christ's love and Christ's love for others. And I know in my own personal context here, there's a great need for services done to the poor, to the hungry. Hunger is an issue out here. There's a lot of that kind of stuff, and and most of the churches out here are willing to give, but it's a very disconnection. Their theology maybe guilt trips them into it. There is no connection to those communities of people, those with money who are the helpers, the givers towards services, are very disconnected from those communities. They live in very nice homes over on this side, while the rest live on this side, kind of a thing. And I think those impact then how justice is perceived, how injustice then is dealt with and encountered. It's very hands off, very over there.